there is a sound your body makes that no one ever taught you to question. A deep, involuntary breath. A sigh that rises from somewhere below the chest, below conscious thought, arriving without warning in the middle of a conversation. A quiet afternoon, a moment that held no reason for exhaustion. You have felt it hundreds of times. You dismissed it every single time. And that dismissal, that trained, automatic act of ignoring the most ancient alarm your energy field possesses, is precisely what has kept you vulnerable, draining, and confused about why you feel hollowed out by days that demanded almost nothing from you. The modern world gave that sound a comfortable name: autonomic respiratory reset, a neurological recalibration, a yawn's quieter cousin. Scientists mapped the mechanics of the diaphragm contracting, the lungs expanding beyond their normal cycle, the vagus nerve briefly resetting its rhythm, and filed it under the vast category of things the body does without meaning anything at all. And so the mystery was dissolved before it could be asked. The question was buried beneath the answer, before anyone thought to wonder whether the answer was designed to bury it. But there were those who wondered. Long before neuroscience built its comfortable architecture of explanations, there were scribes in the Egyptian desert, copyists in hidden communities along the Dead Sea, and wandering teachers in the Aramaic-speaking world who understood that the human body does not do anything without meaning. Not the flinch before danger arrives. Not the chill that runs through the spine in an empty room. And certainly not the deep, shuddering exhale that steals your energy in plain sight, in broad daylight, without asking your permission. They called it something the modern world was never meant to hear. In the cosmology that the institutionalized church worked for centuries to erase, not reform, not reinterpret, but erase, the human being was never simply a biological organism navigating a physical world. The physical world itself was understood to be a construct. A dense, frequency-lowered projection emanating from a lesser architect they called the Demiurge, populated and maintained by intermediary intelligences, whose entire function was to ensure that the luminous particles of divine consciousness trapped within human forms never remembered what they were. These intelligences had a name. The Gnostic manuscripts found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, sealed inside clay jars for nearly 2,000 years, referred to them as archons, from the Greek word for rulers. Not rulers of governments, not rulers of armies, rulers of perception, architects of distraction, harvesters of the one resource the material world cannot generate on its own: vital energy. The archons, as described in texts that the early church fathers did not merely disagree with but actively hunted, classified, and burned, do not feed on flesh. They do not operate through crude physical mechanisms. They operate on frequency. They attach to fields. They locate points of weakness in the luminous envelope that surrounds every human being, what the ancient world called the aura, the light body, the subtle field that extends beyond the skin and carries the signature of the monad, the divine spark, the fragment of original light that even the densest material existence cannot fully extinguish. And when that field develops a tear, a rupture, a moment of incoherence, they feed. The sigh is the sound of that feeding completing. Read that again, not as metaphor, not as poetic imagery designed to make a spiritual concept feel more dramatic, as a literal description of an energetic event that has been occurring in your body, in your field, in your life, possibly every single day, while every system designed to explain human experience handed you a biological footnote and told you to move on. Think about the specific quality of that exhaustion, not the tiredness that comes from physical labor, from a sleepless night, from emotional grief. Those forms of fatigue carry a logic, a traceable cause, a story the body tells that makes sense. This exhaustion is different. It arrives without warning. It arrives in moments of stillness. It arrives after sleep. It arrives in rooms where nothing happened, on afternoons where nothing was demanded of you, in the middle of conversations that were not draining by any observable measure. And when the deep sigh comes, it is not followed by relief. It is followed by a heaviness that was not there before, a subtle dimming, the sense that something was just taken from you, though you cannot name what. The Gnostic scribes named it. The texts they left behind, many of them deliberately excluded from what eventually became the canonical Bible through a process of ecclesiastical selection that had as much to do with power consolidation as with spiritual discernment, described the archonic feeding cycle with a precision that only makes sense if it was written by people who had directly observed it. They wrote about the pneuma, the Greek term for breath spirit, the animating force that does not belong to the material body but inhabits it temporarily, the way light inhabits a lamp without belonging to the glass. They described how the archons could not consume the pneuma directly. The monad's frequency was too high, too coherent, too close to the original light to be simply absorbed. So they developed what the texts describe as the cycle of kenosis, a Greek word that translates roughly as emptying, a sustained process of creating conditions that would cause the human field to fracture, to vibrate inconsistently, to lose the coherent resonance that kept it sealed. Fear fractures the field. Shame fractures the field. Chronic low-level anxiety, the kind that modern civilization has been architecturally designed to produce and maintain, fractures the field continuously. And in the moment of fracture, when the aura opens at its weakest point and the pneuma becomes briefly accessible to extraction, the body registers the event as a sigh, an involuntary intake and release of breath so deep it momentarily disrupts normal respiratory rhythm. The ancient teachers who understood this called it the rupture sound, not a medical term, not a clinical classification, but an exact description of what was actually happening, the audible echo of an energetic breach. And here is where the construction of ignorance becomes truly elegant in its cruelty. The religious systems that replaced the Gnostic understanding systems built, it must be said, on a foundation of selected texts, suppressed gospels, and councils of men deciding which fragments of divine knowledge the population was permitted to access, did not simply fail to teach you about the sigh. They actively recontextualized the breath itself. The sacred breath, the nishimta in the Aramaic tradition, the living breath that the oldest Semitic stories describe as the substance through which the divine consciousness entered the human form, was stripped of its technical dimensions and reduced to a symbol, a metaphor for divine inspiration, a poetic image to be contemplated rather than a functional tool to be used. The breath became a sermon illustration. The most powerful energetic instrument the human body possesses was turned into a figure of speech. And every single day, while the figure of speech sat quietly in theological books that almost no one reads, the rupture sound continued, continues now, is probably happening to someone you know before they finish reading this sentence. But the technique that was buried alongside the teaching has not disappeared. It was encoded, hidden in plain sight, the way all truly dangerous knowledge is hidden, not locked in a vault, but disguised as something ordinary, something devotional, something so simple that the systems of control could afford to leave it in partial view, confident that no one would understand what they were actually looking at. What that technique is, what the Aramaic masters understood about the breath that the modern world was deliberately denied, and why activating it creates a specific vibrational frequency that closes the very rupture points the archons depend on, that is where this unravels into something the religion you were handed never intended you to know. The word was never translated correctly. That is not an accident, it is the entire mechanism. When the earliest Aramaic-speaking communities passed down the teaching of the sacred breath, they used a word that carries within its root structure an entire cosmology, a complete map of the human energy field, its relationship to the divine, and the precise vulnerability that the forces of extraction have always exploited. The word is nishimta. and every tradition that inherited it, from the early Kabbalistic schools to the communities that predated what eventually became Rabbinic Judaism, understood that this was not a word that described breathing. It was a word that described a state of being that breathing, performed correctly, could either protect or destroy. The root nasham, from which nishimta derives, does not simply mean to exhale. It means to cause the divine breath to move in a sealed circuit. The sealing is everything. The ancient teachers were not teaching relaxation techniques. They were teaching a method of closing the human field against external penetration, a pneumatic seal, a vibrational coherence so specific in its frequency that the archonic intelligences, whose entire feeding mechanism depends on the incoherence of an open and fluctuating field, could not locate a point of entry. The breath was not a spiritual metaphor. It was an energetic lock. And the lock was removed from the door before the house was handed to you. Consider what happens in the body during an archonic extraction cycle, described now not through abstract cosmology, but through the precise physiological sequence that the Gnostic manuscripts cross-reference with what we would today recognize as somatic experience. The process begins not in a moment of crisis, but in a moment of depletion, a subtle cumulative erosion of the field's coherence that happens across hours, sometimes days, of sustained low-frequency emotional states. Worry without an object, guilt recycled through memory, the specific anxiety that modern environments are designed to generate continuously, the background noise of inadequacy and urgency that has no single source and therefore no single resolution. The field does not rupture suddenly under these conditions. It thins. It becomes porous at its outer edges, the way a magnetic field weakens at its periphery when the source of its coherence is gradually drained. The archons, as described in the Apocryphon of John, one of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, and one of the most systematically suppressed documents in the history of organized religion, do not wait for a full rupture. They feed at the thinning. Long before the sigh announces the breach, the extraction has already been occurring at a level beneath conscious awareness. The sigh is the completion signal. The sound the field makes when the cycle closes, and the pneuma, the specific vibrational frequency of the monadic spark that was temporarily accessible through the thinned membrane, is drawn out and consumed. What is consumed exactly? This is the part the traditional church had the most to lose by allowing people to understand. The pneuma that the archons extract is not the monad itself. The monad, the fragment of original uncreated light that constitutes the true self, the consciousness that exists prior to and independent of the material body, cannot be consumed. It can be suppressed. It can be buried under so many layers of archonic conditioning, fear programming, and identity confusion that it effectively ceases to function. But it cannot be destroyed and it cannot be taken. What can be taken is the pneuma's radiant output, the vibrational energy that the monad generates as it attempts to express itself through the material form. Think of it as the light a flame produces. The archons cannot extinguish the flame, but they can continuously harvest the light it emits, keeping the flame burning just enough to keep producing what they consume, while the being that hosts that flame lives in a state of perpetual dimness, perpetually generating energy that perpetually disappears, never understanding why the accumulation never comes. This is the energetic architecture of human suffering that the Gnostic tradition diagnosed with a clarity so uncomfortable that 3 centuries of institutional religious authority were required to bury it. And the Nishimta technique was the diagnosis remedy. Here is what was actually taught before the teaching was encoded and hidden in plain sight within devotional practices that retained the outer form while surgically removing the inner function. The Aramaic breath masters, the pneumatic ones, those who had awakened to the monadic nature of their true consciousness, understood that the human respiratory system is not merely a gas exchange mechanism. It is the primary interface between the dense material body and the subtle energy field that surrounds and interpenetrates it. Every breath cycle either reinforces the field's coherence or contributes to its dissolution, depending entirely on the quality, rhythm, and intentional charge of the breath itself. Unconscious breathing, the automatic respiration that modern humans perform approximately 23,000 times per day without a single moment of awareness, is field neutral at best and field eroding at worst. When breath is unconscious, it follows the body's emotional state rather than correcting it. Fear breathing is shallow, rapid, and chest-centered, which according to the ancient maps of the energy body concentrates activity in the upper field and leaves the lower energy centers, the roots of the monadic connection, unprotected and accessible. Shame breathing collapses the chest entirely, creating what the old texts describe as a field fold, a point where the aura literally creases inward and creates a permanent thin point, a chronic vulnerability that archonic intelligences can return to repeatedly across an entire lifetime. The Nishimta practice was designed to reverse all of this with a single, technically precise action. It begins not with an inhale but with a sound. Specifically, the Aramaic consonantal vibration transliterated as shin, the sound produced when air is forced through the slightly constricted space between the upper teeth and the lower lip, a sustained sibilant frequency that the ancient teachers described as the acoustic signature of the divine fire, the Shekinah, the luminous presence whose vibrational frequency is incompatible with archonic resonance. Not incompatible in a symbolic sense. Incompatible in the literal sense that two frequencies too far apart on the vibrational spectrum cannot occupy the same energetic space simultaneously. When the shin sound is produced correctly sustained, generated from the diaphragm rather than the throat, felt as a vibration in the sternum and the upper chest rather than simply heard as a sound, it creates a wave of coherence that moves outward from the center of the body through the energy field, reinforcing the field's outer membrane in the same motion. This is the part that was never supposed to reach you. The exhale follows the shin sound, and it is not the ordinary exhale of unconscious breathing. It is a structured release in three distinct phases that the Aramaic masters called the three seals, a term that survived in fragmented form in certain Kabbalistic texts, but was stripped of its functional context, preserved as a mystical phrase without the technical instruction that made it a working tool. The first seal is the release of the lower field, beginning the exhale from the belly and intentionally emptying the lower torso completely. The second seal is the closing of the midfield, a brief suspension of breath at the halfway point of the exhale that the ancient texts describe as the moment when the field's coherence locks, the fraction of a second when the monadic frequency reaches its highest coherent expression and the archonic access points close. The third seal is the completion of the exhale with a specific nasal closure, a subtle physical action that creates what the teachers call the field cap, the sealing of the crown's energy output, so that the coherence established during the breath cycle is not immediately dissipated through the top of the field. The full cycle, performed with awareness and with the shin sound as its initiating frequency, was described in the manuscripts as generating what the Greek-influenced Gnostic writers translated as phatismos illumination, not as a metaphor for intellectual understanding, but as a literal description of the field's visible radiance increasing, the monad's output becoming briefly unobstructed. The archonic extraction cycle breaking, because the coherence of the field eliminated the thin points and rupture sites that made extraction possible. The breath did not invite the divine. The breath restored the conditions under which the divine that was already present could express itself without being continuously harvested. But here is where the escalation cuts deeper than technique. Because the Nishimta practice was not merely a personal protection method, the Gnostic communities that preserved it understood that archonic feeding is not only an individual phenomenon, it is a collective one. The thin points in individual fields do not exist in isolation. They resonate with the thin points in other fields in proximity, creating what the manuscripts describe as a field web of vulnerability, a collective energetic architecture in which the sustained low-frequency emotional states of a population create a shared membrane of depletion that feeds the archonic intelligences on a scale that individual extraction cannot approach. Every gathering designed to generate sustained shame, fear, or helplessness is, in the energetic framework the ancient teachers described, a collective feeding event. Every system that normalizes chronic anxiety as a condition of ordinary life is not a failure of social design. It is a feature of archonic infrastructure. Every institution that took the nishimta, the breath seal, the energetic lock, and converted it into a passive metaphor for divine grace that requires no activation, no practice, no technical precision, removed from the population the one tool that could have interrupted the harvest. And this is only the layer you are allowed to see. Because what happens in the subtle planes when the nishimta is activated, what entities perceive, what movements occur in the archonic structure when a single human field achieves full coherence, is the revelation that dismantles the entire architecture of spiritual control from the inside out. When the field seals, something on the other side notices. This is the detail that every system of spiritual control, from the councils that selected the canonical scriptures to the institutional frameworks that replaced direct energetic knowledge with doctrinal obedience, needed you never to understand. Because the nishimta activation is not a passive event. It is not a quiet personal practice that produces a gentle sense of calm and asks nothing further of the world around it. When the three seals complete, when the shin frequency has moved through the field, when the exhale has locked the midpoint coherence, when the field cap closes the crown's dissipation, what occurs in the subtle planes is not subtle at all. The archonic intelligences do not simply lose their feeding access. They register the loss as a signal. The Gnostic manuscripts that survived the systematic destruction campaigns of the 4th and 5th centuries, the burnings, the excommunications, the deliberate rewriting of community histories that transformed living pneumatic teachers into dangerous heretics, described this moment with language that the translators who eventually handled these texts consistently softened, because the literal meaning was too precise to be comfortable. The word they used was anachoresis, a withdrawal. But not the withdrawal of something that was merely passing through. The withdrawal of something that had established residency, that had built, over years or decades of sustained feeding access, what the texts described as an energetic claim, a territorial anchor in the thin points of the field that the archon returned to with the regularity and assumption of ownership that a predator returns to a known water source. When the nishimta seals the field completely, that claim dissolves, not gradually. Not over days of consistent practice that slowly erode the attachment. In the moment of full coherence, the archonic anchor loses its foundation instantaneously. The vibrational incompatibility that the shin frequency creates is not a barrier the entity pushes against and eventually wears down. It is a frequency the entity cannot remain near. The manuscripts compared it to what happens when extreme heat contacts a substance that cannot sustain it. There is no negotiation. There is no gradual process. There is simply the incompatibility expressing itself at the speed of frequency, which is the speed of light, which is the speed at which the monad operates when nothing is obstructing it. What the person performing the nishimta experiences in this moment is not what the spiritual entertainment industry has trained you to expect. There is no vision, no golden light flooding the room, no overwhelming sensation of divine presence descending from above. What the ancient teachers consistently described, and what was preserved in enough fragmentary texts across enough separate traditions to constitute something more than poetic convention, was a specific somatic signature, a sudden and complete absence of the background weight, not a feeling added, a feeling removed. the low-level chronic heaviness that you have carried so consistently that you stopped perceiving it as something external, stopped recognizing it as something that arrived from outside and attached, suddenly lifts. And in its absence, you feel something that the modern world has almost no accurate language for. You feel the actual weight of yourself. Only yourself, without the addition. The Gnostic writers called this gnosis in its most immediate, non-intellectual sense. Not knowledge as information, but knowledge as direct recognition. The recognition of the monad's presence not as a theological concept to be believed, but as a living frequency to be felt, distinct and unmistakable. Now that the energetic noise of the extraction cycle has been interrupted, and the field is, for perhaps the first time in years, producing light that is not immediately harvested before you can perceive it. This is the recovery the ancient teachers were pointing toward, not salvation delivered from outside, not grace descending as a gift from a distant divine authority that requires your sustained submission as the price of admission. The monad was never absent. It was never taken. It was generating light continuously, the way a sun generates light regardless of whether anyone on the surface of its planet is able to see clearly. And the only reason you could not feel it was that everything between the source and your perception had been deliberately engineered to consume the output before it reached you. The breath was always the way back, not because it is magical in some decorative sense, because it is the primary physical mechanism through which the material body interfaces with the subtle field, because frequency is not metaphor, because the Shin vibration is not arbitrary. It was identified across centuries of direct energetic observation as the specific acoustic frequency that the archonic resonance cannot overlap with, cannot entrain to, cannot survive in proximity to, because its vibrational signature is too close to the monad's own output frequency to be anything other than hostile to what feeds on the monad's suppression. The religion that replaced this understanding did not do so out of ignorance. This is the distinction that changes everything about how you understand the history of spiritual knowledge on this planet. Ignorance would have preserved the technique imperfectly, corrupted it gradually, allowed it to drift into something unrecognizable over centuries of telephone game transmission. What happened to the Nishimta was not gradual drift. It was surgical removal. The outer container, the breath, the prayer, the devotional posture, was kept intact and institutionalized precisely because the outer container without the inner function is harmless. A population that breathes devotionally but does not understand the field mechanics of what they are doing generates a performance of spirituality that produces no actual energetic coherence. It generates, in fact, the opposite, the particular form of spiritual longing that is never satisfied, the hunger for divine connection that keeps returning to the institution that cannot feed it, the cycle of seeking and disappointment that keeps the seeker in a state of sustained low-frequency emotional depletion, which feeds the field web, which is not an unfortunate side effect. It is the point. The teachers who understood this paid the price that teachers who understand things like this have always paid. The communities at Nag Hammadi did not bury their texts out of casual caution. They buried them because the alternative was watching them burn, the way the library at Alexandria burned, the way the Cathar communities of southern France burned in the 13th century, the way every concentrated repository of this specific category of knowledge, the practical, technical, energetically functional kind, as opposed to the theological and symbolic kind, has been burned, suppressed, or absorbed and emptied whenever the systems that depend on human energetic depletion have had the power to reach it. The jars held, the desert held, and now the texts exist, translated, accessible, carrying within their damaged and fragmentary pages enough of the original transmission that someone willing to read beneath the surface of the academic footnotes can still reconstruct what the burning was trying to erase. And here is what that reconstruction points toward, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. The Nishimta was never meant to be a solitary practice. The Gnostic communities that preserved it understood that a single sealed field, while genuinely protected from individual archonic extraction, exists within the larger field web of collective depletion. One coherent field in a population of incoherent ones is a lamp in a dark room, visible, but isolated. The ancient teachers described the goal not as individual energetic sovereignty alone, but as what they called symphonia, a Greek word meaning sounding together, the specific condition that arises when multiple coherent fields resonate in proximity and create a collective frequency too high, too unified, and too structurally coherent for archonic infrastructure to penetrate. This is why the suppression was never only about silencing individuals. It was about preventing the symphonia from forming, about ensuring that the people who carried fragments of this knowledge remained isolated from each other, divided by the very theological disagreements that the institutional systems manufactured and maintained for exactly this purpose. You cannot create a collective field coherence among people who are arguing about which version of the suppressed text is the authentic one. You cannot create symphonia among people who have been trained to compete for spiritual status within a hierarchy designed by the system that feeds on their depletion. The archonic infrastructure is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by fragmentation, by the specific, sustained social architecture that keeps potentially resonant consciousnesses separated, suspicious of each other, and individually depleted enough that the idea of collective coherence feels like a distant abstraction rather than an immediately available energetic reality. What you are carrying now, this specific map of the rupture, the extraction cycle, the Shin frequency, the three seals, is not information to be stored and occasionally referenced. It is a functional tool. The kind that only functions when it is used, and whose use produces not a comfortable feeling of spiritual accomplishment, but an actual, perceivable shift in the quality of your field. A shift the monad registers not as reward for good behavior, but as simple physics, the natural state of a coherent system from which the interference has been temporarily removed. The psi will come again. The field is not sealed permanently by a single practice in a world architecturally designed to erode it. But now you know what the psi is. You know what completed when you heard it. You know the name of the frequency that closes what was opened, and you know that the closing is not a spiritual achievement requiring years of institutional training and doctrinal compliance. It requires a sound, a breath, three seals, and the willingness to recognize that what you have been calling exhaustion has always been something being taken, and that what is taken can be reclaimed. Not tomorrow, not after sufficient devotion to a system that profits from your depletion, but in the length of a single exhale that was encoded for you 2,000 years ago and buried in desert sand until the moment you were ready to find it. The monad does not wait for permission to shine. It was only ever waiting for the field to stop being emptied long enough to let you feel it. That feeling is not the destination. That feeling is the memory of what you were before the extraction began. And every sealed breath is a choice to remember, not as nostalgia, not as spiritual fantasy, but as a frequency. Real, accessible, yours. The system that took the nishimta from you was not more powerful than the breath that can restore it. It was only older at hiding.